right, thank you so much. Hopefully everyone can see my screen and can hear me. If you cannot, please shout out. All right, so thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'm Fahad Mahmood. I'm a fairly new assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I'm an experimentalist. So I build new types of spectroscopies to probe correlated materials. And so today I want to sort of give you a broad overview of two new techniques that I've been working on and sort of try to leave with the impression that they can sort of access information that we couldn't access before. So one half of my talk is going to be on a strongly correlated system. It's an experimental talk. And the second half is on this new technique that we're setting up called Double-ARPES or double angle resolved photo emission, and how it can measure some important properties of unconventional superconductors. So just to sort of set the stage, we all know there's some key problems in strongly correlated physics that have yet to be conclusively solved. An example of this would be trying to understand the nature of quasi-particles. When you have strong correlations present, we understand them very well in the case of Fermi liquid theory, but if you have strong correlations, what happens then? Another issue is obviously various types of pairing mechanisms in unconventional superconductors. Is there a direct probe of those mechanisms? Is there a direct probe of what's called finite momentum superconducting pairing? And so lastly, another problem that I've been very interested in is if you have frustrated magnets or these things called quantum spin liquids, can we directly detect fractionalization in these frustrated systems? And one example of that fractionalization is emergent particles called spin-ons. And so the three problems I'm highlighting here, there are very good ways of trying to tackle them using what is typically our conventional spectroscopies in condensed matter, most of which involve probing a system with single particles and trying to see how, let's say, your spectral function or your correlation function would deviate from what is predicted by, let's say, Landau Fermi theory. So for example, ARPES is an experiment where you put one photon in and you measure one electron out. Infrared or terahertz spectroscopy, or typically our optical spectroscopies, are again one electric field in through a sample and then measuring how that electric field of an infrared pulse changes due to the presence of the sample. So again, one sort of probe in. What I want to talk about are these new types of spectroscopies that are being useful for correlated materials, where rather than using one particle or one electric field, you are measuring pairs of particles or two electric fields to probe a sample. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what's known as terahertz 2D coherent spectroscopy. Here, we think we have sort of shed some insight onto a problem of what's been known as an electron glass or a Coulomb glass, and studying this by this new technique of 2D coherent spectroscopy. And then the second thing I want to talk about is this Double-ARPES system that we're setting up. There's a theory work here which nicely shows how you can distinguish between finite momentum superconducting pairing using Double-ARPES. Okay. So these are sort of unrelated in some sense, but I thought this is a sort of a broad conference so I can talk about each of them, and hopefully this would be of interest. So to start with, let me just sort of introduce what the first part of the talk is. This is terahertz 2D coherent spectroscopy. This I did in the lab of Peter Armitage at Johns Hopkins with a graduate student Dipanjan Chaudhary, who's now at the University of Illinois, and a theory work by Rahul Nankishore and Sarang Gopalkrishnan. And this has been published. There's also very nice news and views that sort of nicely summarizes this work. Okay, so the first problem I want to address with this multidimensional terahertz technique is this question, which was sort of posed by Anderson, and I'll discuss what that question means in a second, is that can an electron glass, or what's known as a Coulomb glass, be adiabatically connected to a weakly interacting Anderson insulator? In short, even in the presence of very strong correlations, can we still characterize our system by non-interacting some emergent quasi-particles? Okay. So to understand this question, we chose a system which is sort of a canonical, strongly correlated system, which is phosphorus doped silicon near its metal insulator transition. So even on the insulating side where you still have strong interactions present and you have disorder, so that it's a strongly correlated system, as I'll show shortly. And we attacked this with this new technique of terahertz 2D coherent spectroscopy. And what we observed was these things called terahertz photon echoes. And from there, we can extract both the energy relaxation and decoherence rates for whatever emergent particles there may be. And from there, we sort of see how they behave with frequency and temperature. And when we sort of conclude that you can actually not adiabatically connect them to an Anderson insulator, and we dub this new sort of phenomenology as a marginal Fermi class. Okay, so those are the main takeaways. So to sort of set the problem here, this is an old problem that's been studied for a while. Of course, everyone here knows that if you start putting in phosphorus and silicon, you're doping a semiconductor. Gradually, you're going to a metal insulator transition. So near the metal insulator transition, some interesting physics starts to happen, and it's an open question, what's the nature of excitations near that transition? Okay. So one way of looking at this is to just consider disorder. So on the insulating side, one way to describe this would be what's known as Anderson insulator, where you essentially have this picture of localized states in space. And so as you go to higher and higher temperatures, your electrons can, one way is at very high temperatures, they can go directly into the conduction band. But as you lower temperature, they can also hop sideways, right, with some help of phonons. And this is what's known as variable range hopping behavior. Okay. So in this case, you can still sort of describe everything by weakly interacting quasi-particles. What's interesting is when we introduce long-range interactions. Okay, so in that sense, now your electrons are sort of localized on each sites. And here, this Coulomb interaction that happens between electrons is truly long-range because overall the system is still insulating. And so your screening is very weak. Okay, so the long-range Coulomb interaction is not screened. So now this is a problem where you have disorder present and you have long-range interactions. And this is the system that's been historically called as an electron glass or a Coulomb glass. Okay. And so this was the question that Anderson posed, is that in this regime where you have disorder and long-range interactions, can you still connect this to an Anderson insulator? Can I still describe this in some case by weakly interacting electron-like quasi-particles? Okay. And so that's the question we want to address. We know that that is the case for your classic Landau Fermi liquid theory, where even though you have this full Fermi surface, and even though you might have some interactions, what your emergent quasi-particles are, they essentially behave as non-interacting electrons. And so there are ways to sort of confirm that is by using optical scattering rate, how that behaves with frequency, it goes as omega squared, or by measuring essentially the resistivity as a function of temperature, and you see this characteristic T square behavior. Okay, so in that case, this would be like your classic metals. Yeah. However, I just want to sort of point out that these are like indirect methods. There are always some assumptions that you're making when you're extracting the scattering rate from sort of linear optical spectroscopy. In the case here, you're actually measuring resistivity with temperature, so it's not clear whether the scattering rate is actually directly proportional to resistivity in this case. We also know that there are some interesting materials, for example, strange metals or non-Fermi liquids, which do not obey this Fermi liquid behavior, where the resistivity or the scattering rate goes as linear in temperature rather than T squared. Okay? And one way of understanding this is sort of this theory called marginal Fermi liquids. Okay? So what happens in these kind of systems? What is sort of the nature of excitations in this system? Okay. So that brings us back to this question, can we sort of have a technique where we can go in and directly extract the scattering rate of whatever excitations there are and understand them as a function of frequency and temperature? So our inspiration for this comes from what's called 2D optical spectroscopy. And I just want to sort of define what I mean by 2D. By 2D, I don't mean 2D materials. I mean two different frequencies or two different light pulses that are incident onto the sample. So if I do a conventional infrared spectroscopy on a system, I essentially plot my absorption as a function of one frequency or one frequency or one light pulse that's going into the sample. When I do a 2D optical spectroscopy, I have two light pulses going in. And so what you end up getting are these 2D maps where you're plotting either absorption or some property of the system, such as its conductivity or susceptibility, as a function of two different frequencies. And this is a very useful technique because now I can not only look at sort of the linear spectra, but I can start looking at sort of cross terms between different mode couplings. Okay, so this was a well-established tool in sort of the infrared range, and it's been very useful for molecular systems or liquids, because those excitations or those, let's say, vibrational modes are usually in the infrared range. If you want to attack a strongly correlated material, I sort of want to implement this technique in what's known as the terahertz range of frequencies, because that terahertz range is sort of very suitable for correlated materials because that's the energy scale over which a lot of these correlations occur. Okay. So just to sort of describe exactly what we're measuring when we do these type of measurements, we'll be measuring a higher order susceptibility rather than just the linear susceptibility of our system. So for example, we could either measure the second harmonic generation or a third harmonic generation, but there are various ways of probing this chi-3 or the third order susceptibility using these type of multidimensional techniques. Okay. So again, going back to this comparison between sort of our 1D spectroscopy and 2D spectroscopy. In 1D case, we plot susceptibility with frequency. In the 2D case, they're two different frequency scales. And so we can look at couplings between different modes. We can distinguish between inhomogeneous broadening and homogeneous broadening, which is sort of very difficult to do when I'm doing linear spectroscopy. Okay. So we're going to try to do all of this in the terahertz range. I'm not going to discuss the details of the setup here, but the main thing about the setup is that you need very high field sources of terahertz because you want to couple to the higher order susceptibilities, which are orders of magnitude weaker than your linear susceptibility. And so you want to send in two very strong terahertz pulses with field strengths on the order of hundreds of kilovolts per centimeter. And then you want to essentially extract the nonlinear susceptibility out. Okay. I'll sort of skip over this because I just want to introduce exactly what we're measuring. So in a very simple case, write down your electric field that's your incident on the sample, calculate what the nonlinear polarization of the material would be, and then express that nonlinear polarization in terms of different frequencies of these two electric fields that are going into your sample. Obviously, this is a very complicated expression. So rather than going through over it step by step, what I want you to sort of take away is that if I express this nonlinear polarization as a function of these frequencies, you can see that there are different types of responses present in this in my experiment, and they will occur at different combinations of these frequencies. So for example, there might be a sum frequency here, there might be a difference frequency over here, and that would allow me to distinguish between these different sort of responses. And they will sort of imply different things about the material system in terms of scattering rates. So for example, one response that you measure in this 2D spectroscopy, it's known as a rephasing response, which occurs at this particular combination of the two frequencies. And as I'm plotting my response as a function of omega j and omega k, the two frequencies I'm sending in, this response will occur at some other particular point in this frequency space. Okay. So how is this connected to actual lifetimes or scattering rates that I was talking about? To sort of see that, we're just going to model our system by, let's say, a system ensemble of two-level systems. Each two-level has a T1 time, which is a relaxation time, and then a decoherence time T2. And so I can write down essentially this density matrix for my two-level system, calculate its nonlinear polarization, and without sort of walking you through the details, if you work out the math, you'll eventually see that this rephasing peak that I was talking about encodes information about the decoherence time, T2, okay? And so if I were to measure this rephasing peak, then I can directly measure the decoherence time of my system, T2, right? And this sort of rephasing peak, if you're familiar with sort of Hahn spin echoes or NMR echo techniques, this is very similar to that, because what's happening is you have an ensemble of two-level systems. They're all decohering at some with some characteristic rate. And so as you move time forward, they all start to sort of dephase from each other. If you reverse time, which is what we're doing with our second pulse, then they're going to come back, and then you'll sort of measure an echo, which is known as the rephasing peak here. Okay, so this has been done sort of in NMR techniques before in spin echoes. So that's what we do when we measure these 2D terahertz spectroscopies. Okay, so without going into the time delays, this is the measured experimental signal from one sample of phosphorus doped silicon. What I'm plotting here is the nonlinear polarization as a function of two frequencies, okay? And as you can see in this quadrant here, this is what's known as the rephasing quadrant. You have a very strong response. This is what's known as photon echo in this multidimensional spectroscopies, okay? And it turns out if you work out sort of this math for this, the width of this echo gives you a measure of the 1/T2 rate for this system, okay? And then you can do that at different frequencies to extract 1/T2 as a function of frequencies. This signal here is what's known as our pump probe signal. So this is your classic pump probe spectroscopy measurements where you send in one pump pulse and then see how the system relaxes over some time. Okay? The width of that gives you that pump probe time or that energy relaxation T1, okay? So we can do this as a function of doping. I should sort of point out here that we're doing this on the insulating side of phosphorus doped silicon. So this is expressed as a function of the critical doping. So 100% would be the metal insulator transition. So what I'm showing here is those 2D maps as a function of doping as you approach the metal insulator transition. What you immediately see is that as you approach the transition, all of these features get very, very sharp, okay? And what that means is that your lifetimes are essentially getting longer and longer, right? The scattering rate is decreasing, lifetimes are getting longer, okay? So that sort of makes sense, because if you just theoretically consider the hopping terms that happen between two different phosphorus sites, for example, that is usually exponentially suppressed in the phosphorus distance. But the Coulomb interactions are only algebraically suppressed. And so as you increase this density of phosphorus dopants, you're decreasing the ratio of interactions to hopping. And that's effectively making the system weakly interacting, which is causing these lifetimes to increase and sort of sharpening the features that we see. Okay, so there's a lot of information in there on these maps. We can sort of take these line cuts that I was describing, and from there extract these 1/T2 and 1/T1 times. So that's what I'm doing here, just to sort of show you this is a simple Lorentzian fit. And then you can sort of do this as a function of frequency. And this is what we get. This is extracting those scattering rates as a function of frequency. And what's very interesting to note is that these scattering rates are essentially linear in frequency. They don't behave as what you would expect from a Fermi liquid, where they should go as omega squared. They're going as omega. And the other interesting thing is sort of what happens as you're increasing temperature. As you're increasing temperature, particularly for the relaxation, the peaks are getting sharper, okay? Which is sort of counterintuitive. Usually when you think about pump probe traces or relaxation with temperature, things sort of gets faster rather than slowing down. So this behavior is sort of inconsistent with sort of phonon behavior. Okay. What we think is happening is this temperature dependence is actually more consistent with the presence of electron-electron interactions or some quasi-particle interactions, because what's happening is that as you're increasing temperature, you may be going above this mobility edge or making excitations in the conduction band, and you're sort of decreasing screening, and maybe that is sort of suppressing our tunneling in some sense. So maybe that's an overview, but we still need to understand this a little bit better. But the key point is, as you, even with other dopings, the scattering rate remains linear with frequency. All right. So to sort of understand this, I'm not going to walk over the sort of the theoretical model, but Sarang and Rahul, they put up a very nice theoretical picture to understand why these rates would scale linearly with frequency. They sort of modeled this as sort of local electrical dipoles, and based on the dipole-dipole interactions they have, they can sort of figure out that this is indeed consistent with this linear in frequency observation that we've measured. Okay, so sort of going back to this question that I had posed earlier, which is this Coulomb glass adiabatically connected to an Anderson insulator? What we are finding is that sort of the answer is no, simply because of this linear in frequency relaxation rates we observe, this sort of counterintuitive temperature dependence that we're observing. It sort of points that the fact that this relaxation is incompatible with phonons, that there are still strong electron-electron interactions present in the system. And so we don't really have a well-defined regime where you can describe the system by non-interacting excitations. Okay, so that is why we sort of dub this thing similar to the marginal Fermi liquid theory. We call this marginal Fermi glass, but that's just a name. It's sort of to describe this observation that we see. Okay, so this was the experiment that we've done in phosphorus doped silicon to sort of just prove that this works on strongly correlated materials. As sort of a follow-up to this, the student that I was working with, Dipanjan, he's been working very hard to extend this to cuprate superconductors, and I thought I should just flash these results because this is a workshop on unconventional superconductors. We're extending the same measurements that we're doing on these cuprates. And so just to sort of highlight what we're measuring here, if you try to do this experiment and essentially measure the third order susceptibility at terahertz frequencies, if you do this on a simple metal, gold, you essentially don't measure anything. It's very linear. There's very weak nonlinear susceptibilities. If you do this on a conventional S-wave superconductor niobium nitride, you measure some nonlinear susceptibility, but that only onsets at TC, at the superconducting TC, which makes sense because superconductors are highly nonlinear. If you do this on the cuprate lanthanum strontium copper oxide, it onsets well above TC, okay? And that's been what we've seen for various different dopings. So what I'm showing here is this is the onset of the third order susceptibility as a function of temperature for two different niobium nitrides. It onsets at TC, but for different LSCOs, both on the underdoped side, the optimally doped and the overdoped side, it onsets at well above 100 Kelvin, okay, even though they have very different superconducting TCs. So this is a work in progress. I just wanted to sort of flash this here. We're still trying to understand what this could mean. It could mean that maybe there's some pairing or superconducting fluctuations above TC, which is sort of the interpretation people make when they do similar kinds of pump probe experiments, but that's something we're trying to understand. Okay. The last thing I sort of want to mention on the 2D terahertz spectroscopy front is, it's been theoretically shown that this is a very useful tool to understand frustrated magnets, particularly quantum spin liquid candidates. It's been one thing, if you're familiar with quantum spin liquids, is that it's been very hard to conclusively say that spin-ons are present in, let's say, triangular lattices or honeycomb lattices for frustrated magnets. And so one way to do this would be if we plot, or if we were to measure the nonlinear magnetic susceptibilities as a function of two different frequencies, then I might be able to directly measure the spin-on lifetime, similar to what we were measuring, if they're present, if what we were doing with the phosphorus doped silicon case. So this is a work in progress. This requires very large terahertz fields, essentially. So this is an experimental challenge, but this is just work that's ongoing experimentally. Okay, how much time do I have? Sorry, I've sort of lost track of time here.
4 more minutes.
4 more minutes, okay, sorry. So I just want to briefly then mention some interesting possibilities with this new technique that we're building up. This is a double angle resolved photoemission spectroscopy. So I'll just sort of briefly go over what the results of this theory paper that we put forward recently. This is a work in collaboration with Dirk Moore. He did most of the heavy lifting for the theoretical work, and Peter Abamonte here at UIUC and Tom Devereaux at SLAC. And what we're going to show here is that how you can use this technique to distinguish between finite momentum superconducting pairing. So most of you sort of know this introduction for ARPES. What does ARPES do? It measures the single particle spectral function, and it's been an incredibly useful tool to measure, let's say, the electronic structure or the Fermi surface of different materials. It's been a very useful tool to measure, let's say, a superconducting gap along the Fermi surface, where the nodes, where the antinodes, all of that, single ARPES can do a very good job. But it does not really give us any insight into the superconducting pairing state. Okay, so what do I mean by that? If I have, essentially, it cannot distinguish between zero momentum pairing, where, let's say, particles from opposite sides of the Fermi surface are paired with respect to each other. So your center of mass momentum for a Cooper pair is essentially zero, which is believed to happen in conventional superconductors. Or, so it cannot distinguish between this and, let's say, finite momentum superconducting pairing. Okay? So this is what would happen in, let's say, a pair density wave phase, which is believed to exist in certain cuprate superconductors, or let's say in the FFLO phase. Okay? What we did is we tried to understand what this double ARPES would measure for 3 different superconducting order parameters. One was a D-wave superconducting parameter here. So here you have pairing, so this is still pairing across opposite sides of the Fermi surface. So let's say pairing between these red points, between these purple points, or these blue points at the antinode. Okay, so those are the points that are paired with each other, but not the, let's say, these points here, the green points. We wanted to contrast this with what happens with a pair density wave, where sort of the phase of the superconducting order parameter is now modulated as a function of space. In momentum space, that looks like that pairing is now occurring either between sort of these points, these green points, or these red points. Okay, so now your Cooper pair has some finite momentum. In the FFLO phase, which the gap looks sort of this way in some representation for in real space, the pairing sort of occurs only between these 2 points in momentum space, but not the red points. Okay. So what experimental technique can allow us to sort of distinguish between these 3? Okay. And so when we were thinking about ideas, we sort of referred to analogy between nuclear particle physics, where if I want to understand the sort of the inner structure of some composite particle, we essentially blast it, and then we sort of detect those various fragments that come out, and that's usually done in a multi-particle way. Okay, so this is what we thought would be a good way to do this on correlated materials, is that rather than measuring 1 electron coming out of your system, why not detect 2 electrons coming out? Okay? So this is what I mean by double ARPES: 1 photon and 2 electrons that are photoemitted. Okay, so there are different ways that this can sort of manifest in a system. One way is that you can measure 2 electrons, that you kick out this electron, and then this electron, via an effective interaction with another electron, gets kicked out. Another way is you're sort of measuring core states. So the photon essentially kicks out a core state. this electron relaxes and then interacts with another electron. So this is more like an OJ process. So these are the two ways in which you can get a double photoemission process. So we're not the first ones to think of this. This has a long history. There's also some very nice theoretical work done on this type of technique, or at least sort of multi-electron techniques. And it's been shown, let's say that, for example, for the case of nickel oxide, that this two-particle counting rate, if we do, let's say, photon in, 2 electrons out, or electron in, 2 electrons out, is orders of magnitude higher in the case of a strongly correlated material like nickel oxide compared to sort of non-correlated materials, right? So we immediately know that this is a very good probe of correlations. Okay? So we want to do this as a function of energy and momentum, right? Okay. So sort of just to guide you over the sort of theoretical details very briefly, I won't go into much detail here, but what our paper is doing is essentially calculating this two-particle counting rate for photoemission, and it is based on this Hamiltonian for photoemission. This is just sort of photoemission for the initial particle. So this is a destruction operator for this part. This is a creation operator for the photoelectron. And then this term here encodes information about this effective interaction. So essentially this has one destruction operator for this part here, destruction operator for the original photoelectron that we had, and then 2 new creation operators for photoelectrons, okay? And this encodes information about this effective interaction. So using this and then putting in different symmetries for the superconducting order parameter, we can calculate what this should look like, all right? So if I do this on just a regular D-wave semiconductor where we have zero momentum, the Cooper pair momentum is effectively zero. So if we look at this two-particle counting rate between opposite points of the Fermi surface, we measure this peak here, the zero energy peak. And this is directly representative of the superconducting condensate, okay? If we do this at points that are not paired, for example, which would be, let me just go over here, these green points on a regular D wave, then you do not see this, this zero frequency peak in the superconducting state. You only see this between points that are paired, okay? So taking this to, let's say, a pair density wave case, again, you only see the zero frequency peak if I'm probing points sort of opposite to them. So I'm probing points which are paired, but not points that are, let's say, effectively zero in the Cooper pair momentum. Okay, so I'm running out of time. So I'm just gonna, this is also the FFLO phase. We can get similar results there. I just wanna briefly flash that we are very close to experimentally implementing this. I'm an experimentalist, so that was all sort of theoretical results. But we're basically going to be using 2 time-of-flight analyzers to perform this double-ARPES measurement as a function of temperature. So essentially probing different parts of the Fermi surface. And just 2 weeks ago, the analyzers were delivered in our lab. And so this is the actual analyzers being set up right now. And so I'm just going to conclude by putting in a shameless plug that, we have a new lab. We have these 2 new interesting techniques. We're building a lot. So if you're interested in developing these, please reach out. Urbana-Champaign is pretty cold, but it's a good place to live. So thank you so much. I'll stop there and take questions.
Thank you very much. We now have 4 minutes for questions. The first hand that I'm seeing was by Jonathan.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the interesting talk and a lot of interesting material to think about. I guess one question I had is simply this, 2 electron ARPES. I mean, maybe you can distinguish between, pair density wave and non-pair density wave, but is it possible that it can also just sort of be used for more mundane purpose of, can you actually, like, for instance, measure the actual, gap function by measuring like the phase around the Fermi surface? Because even this would, I think, be very
yeah, right. So it can
useful.
also, yeah, exactly. It can also be used for that, measuring the gap function, which I sort of wanted to highlight on the D-wave case, is that it'll be a more direct measure compared to, you know, it can directly point out what the gap structure is. And then phase information, I think we can also obtain, because what I sort of didn't mention here is that from our experimental process, we are putting in a laser source, and it has to be a laser source because the timing is important. We're measuring in a coincidence way. And so based on the phase of the laser source, and then you can play tricks with one laser source or two laser source, then you can start asking what the phase of the photo-emitted electron is, things like that. But there are things that we are thinking along those lines. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yep.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that would be super cool.
The next one is Andrei Chubukov.
Oh, I think you're muted. Sorry.
Let me unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, very good. Sorry, that's it. Look, a very simple question. You put a difference between pair density wave and FFLO, as if in one case you have pairs with momentum Q, another case you have pairs with Q and minus Q.
Yes.
Is there one pair of fermions or two? I think it's a difference between what we call FF and what we call LO, parts of FFLO. In one case, it's a pairing with one Q, in another case, it's a pairing with two Qs. So in one case, it's exponent, in another case, it's cosine function. But it's not the difference between pair density wave and FFLO in this regard, as far as I understand.
I think that's correct. I wanted to sort of emphasize that but as far as I understand, in the pair density wave, you will have pairing of Q and minus Q.
You may have either or.
Oh,
we
either
can have
or.
pair density wave with one Q, we can have pair density wave with two Q.
I see. Okay, sure.
So in this respect, pair density wave is FFLO.
Ah, okay, right. Okay, so I think that, yeah, maybe we should then, I think you're right that we should clarify that a little better. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
The next question will be by Thais Trevisan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the very nice talk. And I have a question in the very beginning of the talk when you show the different types of response that we can find in the nonlinear spectrum. And I just want to check, like, do I understand correctly if I want to look, for example, to third harmonic generation? Would this be a specific cut in our 2D spectrum?
Yeah, it
or it's more complicated than that?
If you want to, so no, it will occur at, sorry, I'm gonna cycle through all these slides. So for example, so third harmonic generation would be, you know, some 3 omega in this direction, right? Or second harmonic would be in this direction. So that would be the 2 omega of this. So it would be in a particular point in frequency space.
I see. So it's a particular point and not a particular cut.
A particular point, and then over that point, it might be some broadening because you might have contributions from levels at different frequencies, things like that. But yeah. So in the simplest 2-level system like that I'm plotting here, this is a particular point. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And now the last question by Jose.
Very nice talk. When you show these nonlinear susceptibilities in cuprates, I mean, one possibility that one can think that this appears above TC maybe is because the charge density wave maybe has a nonlinear susceptibility. Is it known how this nonlinear susceptibility behave in charge density waves in general?
Right. So actually, we're doing experiments right now on just pure charge density waves, one-dimensional, no superconductivity, and obviously charge density waves are also very nonlinear. The interesting about the cuprates here is that this type of behavior persists well also into the overdope regime. So some of these dopings are like 0.23, for example, for strontium, where at least, to my knowledge, there's no charge density wave. And the onset temperature of this seems to be very similar regardless of doping. So yes, at least definitely for the underdoped. In fact, I think for the underdoped case, there is definitely some contribution for recharge density wave, but yeah, that's something we're analyzing. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
I see one more question by Victoria.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned that in the last part of your talk that the pulse emits electron from the core state. You called it core state. So I wonder, is it a valence band? And if it is, will it actually hold the properties of superconductor? Because I mean, there is a gap or let's say some region of Fermi C which is coupled. But if you go very deep, will it actually reflect the properties of superconductor?
Right. I think I went by that really fast. I think what I was saying was in a generic for a double-ARPES experiment, you can either get photo emission from just your Fermi or near the Fermi level or from core states. And then so you could also have double photo emission from both. But I think I was trying to say that we're going to understand superconductivity, we're not going to do the core level or the and then you can just do that by tuning the photon energy, keeping it so that it's closer to the Fermi. But that's so I was trying to sort of emphasize that for this calculation, we're not measuring or not calculating the core level photo emission. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great.